One of the more confusing things after narcissistic abuse is realizing that even when you turn out to be right, you may still question yourself afterward. You notice something feels off, and then later you find out your read on the situation was accurate. And you would think that would make it easier to trust yourself the next time. But often, it doesn't. You can have moment after moment where you look back and think, no, I actually did see that correctly. And then the next time something feels off, you're right back to, did I misunderstand? Am I making too much of this? What if I'm wrong this time? After a while, the second guessing itself can start to feel like evidence. Maybe your judgment really is unreliable. Maybe you can't trust your read on things anymore. Maybe this is just who you've become. But there's another way to understand what may be happening. Second guessing yourself is not always the absence of perception. Sometimes the perception was there all along. The doubt came afterward. And that distinction matters. Because if you treat the doubt as proof that you didn't see clearly, you can end up questioning your ability to perceive something that you may have actually perceived quite accurately in the first place. We tend to assume that confidence should follow accuracy. If you're right often enough, eventually you should trust yourself. But after prolonged narcissistic abuse, those two things don't always move together that neatly. You may recognize an inconsistency. You may notice when something doesn't add up. You may have an immediate sense that something about an interaction is off. And then, almost immediately, wonder, but am I sure? Accuracy and authority are not the same psychological experience. You can see something accurately and still have a hard time letting your own perception carry enough weight to stand. That can happen when your experience has been challenged, reinterpreted, minimized, or turned back against you over and over again. You don't necessarily stop noticing what's happening, but noticing may stop feeling like enough. You have a reaction, and then you review it. You have a concern, and then you argue with it. Something feels wrong, and your mind immediately starts building the case for why maybe it's actually fine. And after a while, that review process can become so familiar that you barely notice you're doing it. It may even feel like you're just being responsible, being fair, making sure you're not jumping to conclusions. And sometimes, reconsidering your first interpretation is healthy. None of us sees everything perfectly. But there's a difference between being willing to reconsider something and feeling like your own perception doesn't get to count until it survives an internal cross-examination. And that difference can get very blurry when you've been questioning yourself for a long time. You may even have situations where someone else eventually confirms exactly what you noticed. And instead of thinking, I knew it, what you mostly feel is relief. Because now it feels safer to believe what you had already seen. That doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't see clearly before. It may mean your own seeing stopped feeling like enough on its own. And that pattern can linger even when the relationship that shaped it is no longer there. When you look at second guessing this way, it starts to mean something different. It doesn't automatically prove that your judgment is bad. It may tell you something about how accustomed you became to putting your own perception back under review. That doesn't mean every instinct is correct. It doesn't mean every interpretation should go unquestioned. And it certainly doesn't mean replacing self-doubt with absolute certainty. It simply means that feeling doubtful and being wrong are not the same thing. You can doubt yourself after perceiving something accurately, and you can feel uncertain and still have good judgment. And you can have plenty of evidence that you were right before without that evidence immediately making you feel more confident the next time. That's why being right once may not settle this, or being right 10 times. Because the deeper disruption may not have been your ability to notice what was happening. It may have been what happened after you noticed. The questioning, the reviewing, the need to make sure. Once you can see that distinction, the second guessing becomes easier to place. It doesn't have to answer the much bigger question, can I trust my mind? It may simply tell you something about what your mind became accustomed to doing with its own perceptions. And those are very different conclusions. So if you recognize this pattern in yourself, the fact that you still experience doubt does not automatically mean your perception is unreliable. Sometimes the perception has already happened before the second guessing begins. Sometimes you noticed. Sometimes you understood. Sometimes you were right. And then the familiar review showed up. Many survivors find that this relationship with their own perception starts to feel different over time. That doesn't mean becoming completely certain about everything. And it doesn't mean reaching some point where you never question yourself again. Questioning ourselves is part of being human. The distinction I want to leave you with is much simpler than that. Questioning yourself and being unable to perceive accurately are not the same thing. So you don't have to make every moment of uncertainty mean something larger about your judgment. And you don't have to resolve the entire question of self-trust from this one idea. For now, it may be enough to recognize that your second guessing doesn't tell the whole story about what you were actually able to see. If you're noticing how often you did perceive something accurately, but still found it difficult to let that perception settle, the 30-day stabilization space is something structured you can step into while you navigate this phase without forcing certainty or trying to resolve everything at once. The link is in the description below whenever you're ready. And if you'd rather stay here and continue orienting at your own pace, you can do that too. Sometimes what was interpreted was not your ability to see, but your confidence that what you saw was allowed to stand. We'll pause here.